Mechanic had every one of these skills. How many of you would also want to know how to fix a car? Could I see your hands, please? In other words, whatever else you do, then you've got to have that specific skill for that. Would you agree with that? Now, this will give you the base to build on. And regardless of the profession you choose, I can teach anybody, how to run the gizmo that manufactures the widgets. In other words, we can teach them procedure, and that's what the employers tell me everywhere. You send me somebody with these qualities right there, I'll teach them the other. They say, yeah, but Zig, those are values. Yep, they sure are. So is lying, cheating, stealing, and irresponsibility values. And if you don't teach one, guess what they're going to happen to them? That's exactly right. They will acquire the others with very, very little effort on their part. Very few parents, have cussing sessions where they get the kids together and say, okay, kids, tonight we're going to learn 3 of the filthiest words you have ever heard. They just don't do those kind of things. But they pick it up from society, from television, from the radio. Hey, they're going to learn it anyhow. And let's take a look right there at what this is really all about, and the importance of being consistent. I think Nathaniel Hawthorne said it best. You cannot be one kind of person long and another kind of performer and get by with it. You ultimately become confused as to who you are, and your effectiveness is dramatically reduced. A lot of people say, well, Zig, aren't kids basically good? Anybody who asks that question has never watched a 2-year-old deal with a new baby brother. I can absolutely guarantee you, no, they are not basically good. We've got to teach them to be good. I love the story of the old Eskimo. Many years ago, in northern Alaska, in one of the villages, they used to have dog fights every Saturday. Well, they were vicious. And this old Eskimo owned 2 dogs, a black one and a white one. And they would always put on an incredible fight. They almost killed each other every Saturday. And interestingly enough, after a period of time, they finally had beaten themselves up so badly they couldn't fight anymore. The Eskimo retired them. And one Saturday somebody asked him, said, I noticed something rather interesting. I noticed that invariably, when you bet on the black dog won. When you bet on the white dog won. How on earth could you tell? Old Eskimo kind of smiled and said, well, it's pretty easy. I just always bet on the one I'd been feeding all week. I bet on the individual who feeds the best part of their nature with the good, the clean, the pure, the powerful, and the positive. That's the individual that I'm going to bet on over a period of time. Now, what are we feeding our young people today? The typical 18-year-old has watched 17,000 hours of television, has listened to 11,000 hours of music, has watched 2,000 hours of MTV or the movies. This does not count telephone time. It does not count athletic event attendance. It does not count dating. It does not count riding around. Now, 30,000 hours of directly being entertained. And yet, I'm going to start a little word. I'm just going to say one word and ask you the question. When you're around the house with the kids, the one thing you hear the most, finish with this, I'm bored. Interesting, isn't it? See, you can't entertain people for life. At some point, we've got to wean them and start teaching them responsibility. We've got to start teaching them that they've got some things they absolutely must do. They've got to learn on their own. You see, in 30,000 hours, you can send your child through kindergarten, grade school, high school, college, medical school, have them serve an internship and a fellowship in less than 30,000 hours. Seems to me that's a better use of the time. Now, don't misunderstand. I believe there should be some pleasure in life. I don't believe if you have some pleasure that you're not going to end up being very happy. You've got to have pleasure, but we need to understand that pleasure, we ought to always ask ourselves 3 questions about it. Number 1, can I repeat this pleasure indefinitely and be happy? See, some pleasures you cannot repeat indefinitely and be happy. For example, they tell me that the first time a person deals with Coke, that there is a pleasurable sensation that absolutely defies belief. It is absolute ecstasy. Now, that's what those who've done it say. Then they say the second thing, that never again do they ever hit that same emotional high, that feeling of ecstasy, as they did on that very first trip. Although they will continue to try. And then something rather fascinating happens. Frightening, really. The coke destroys the brain's ability to reproduce dopamine and norepinephrine. And without those two neurotransmitters, it is impossible to experience joy and happiness. They sought a shortcut to happiness. Through that pleasure, destroyed any chance of being happy. Can I repeat this pleasure indefinitely and, without any danger? Number two, is it morally right and fair to everyone concerned? You cannot be happy on somebody else's back. It just does not work that way. If you're taken from somebody, you're going to have a very short-term pleasure, but permanent happiness is not going to be there. Now, number three is kind of hitting you below the belt, but here's the third question. Would I be willing for my mama to know I'm doing this? Or to put it another way, would I be willing for this to show up in tomorrow morning's headlines, all right? We need to teach responsibility, but here's the exciting thing, and I think it's tremendously exciting, and I've said this in an earlier recording. We see, what you do off the job determines how far you go on the job. It also determines how well the kids do in school. Now, let me give you some interesting data which says a lot. Did a study on the typical American factory. In the typical manufacturing plant, the person who works by the hour on the line watches an average of 30 hours of television a week. The person in charge of the line watches an average of 25 hours of television a week. The foreman watches 20 hours of television a week. Are you noticing a little trend there? The plant superintendent watches 12 to 15 hours of television a week. The president watches 8 to 12 hours of television a week. The chairman of the board watches 4 to 8 hours of television a week. And 50% of that time, he or she is watching a training video. Now, let me ask you a question. One of the publications I read recently came out with this data. How 47% of the people feel they never have time to do anything. And yet the same people are saying they spend endless, mindless hours watching television, and 2 days later they don't have a clue as to what they learned. Here's my question. Those people who work on the line by the hour, watching 30 hours of television a week, how many of you believe that if they were to take 10 of those hours and get involved in personal growth and development and seminars and reading and learning and studying, that they might not have permanent jobs working by the hour on the line? Does that make any sense at all, folks? I don't think there's any question about it. In other words, we are not victims. There are some things that we can do to take responsibility and to take action. Now, do we really need to teach our kids all of these qualities? Well, let me give you this information. The Search Institute out of Minneapolis, Minnesota, did a survey of 270,000 young people in 600 communities in 33 states. Our research reveals that 75% of American teenagers have 20 or fewer essential developmental assets, the values and standards, the activities and structure that serve both as a safety net against destructive behavior and as an encouragement to positive action. We're not teaching what they need to know. You give me kids that have been taught these values we've been talking about, these qualities, and I'll give you a kid who's potentially a brilliant producer, who will succeed wherever they are. USA Today, August the 2nd, 1995, said 70% of the college students admitted cheating. 29 to 35% of the medical students admit on their applications concerning their research that they had exaggerated. 46% of the teens believe lying is okay. And the most frightening word that I think I've ever read in a news article, then it says only 31% of the adults do. What about that? What do we teach? How do we teach it? Telephone rings in a lot of homes. The parents, as you know, they've been telling them all the time, tell the truth. Telephone rings. Tell them I'm not home. Obey the law. Now, the reason I use a fuzzbuster is Now what they're really saying is, look, kid, if you're going to break the law, don't be a dumb bunny and get caught. Be smart like your old man. I mean, use your head. Why should we teach something else? It's practical. It's practical. Mortimer Feinberg, in his book, Corporate Bigamy, did an interview with 100 of the CEOs of the Fortune 500 companies and asked them what is necessary to go to the top and stay there. The answer, they got to build their careers on honesty, character, and integrity. And then they put the little summation on anybody who thinks they can go to the top and stay there, who's not honest, is dumb. You know, that's about as strong as it can get. The Justice from the Institute for the Advancement of Ethics says an unprecedented proportion of today's youth lack commitment to core moral values like honesty, personal responsibility, respect for others, and civic duty. Now, I want to emphasize something. I'm really not blaming the kids by any stretch of imagination. You see, it is not the kids' fault. Very few of them own television stations and music stations, and very few of them publish Penthouse and Playboy and all of that kind of stuff. It's our responsibility, civically, because, you see, we're all involved in crime and drugs and alcohol. My son lost his best friend when a drunken teenager ran through a go light and killed him at 90 miles an hour. We're involved in drugs. My brother-in-law had his home broken into. An heirloom pitcher was stolen. 2 hours later,